There we are. Okay, welcome everyone to the City of Shoreline Climate Champion Series. We're on week 3 and I'm very excited to have our 2 speakers here tonight from King County. And before we get started, we'll just go ahead and cover some housekeeping things here. All right. There we are. So just as a reminder, this is our lineup of topics. So tonight we're talking about the climate equity nexus and discussing why it's important to apply an equity lens to climate action planning and programs. All right, and what you can expect from us tonight is we're going to learn more about climate, excuse me, I forgot to change that slide. We're going to learn more about climate resilience in the way of climate equity and from Jamie Stroble and Saba Rahman from King County. And the presentations will run at least through 8:15 p.m. We have a lot to share tonight, so we may be on the longer side this evening, but we do hope to have 10 minutes for Q&A. And be sure to stay to the end to find out what's next. And just to let you all know that since we're in webinar mode, we do have everyone muted and with your videos turned off. And we are monitoring the chat box. So please use that to ask any questions you have. And the recording will be uploaded and shared tomorrow afternoon. What we are hoping from you is that you stay engaged and ask questions. I'll be monitoring the chat box, as will one of our other panelists, and we'll be getting to those as we can. And the chat box should be a bar at the either at the bottom or top of your screen that you can type your questions in there. Just ask that everyone be respectful and considerate of each other. If you need a break, take one, no problem. And we do have a survey that's coming out at the end of the session and is available tomorrow. So please fill that out. We'd love to hear your feedback. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I'm thrilled to introduce Jamie Stroble and Saba Rahman. And Jamie is the Climate Engagement and Community Partnership Specialist at King County. And she is the lead for Sustainable and Resilient Frontline Communities and the lead facilitator for the Climate Equity Community Task Force. And Saba is Climate Engagement and Preparedness Coordinator, and I'm just thrilled, as I mentioned, to have them here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this time and let both of you take it from here.
Thank you, Heather. We're really excited to be here today, and the timing is actually appropriate because we just finished and released a big climate justice framework for King County at the end of last month. So we're going to share a little bit about what ended up in that, as well as some background about the intersections between equity and climate change. Saba's going to start us off because we want to make sure we get a chance to know who all is here and who's attending. And I'll have her take over.
All right, so we have a couple poll questions. We're using poll everywhere, and this is just to get to know everyone. So if you type in, actually, Jamie, if you want to pop this in the chat box too, then that might be easier for folks to click on. We can go this way, and then you can also text in if you are not on a computer, if you're watching from your phone. So right at the top of the screen, you can see you can text or you can go to the website. And as you all start responding to this first question about where you're zooming in from, it's going to start populating in here.
You can open another browser or you can choose to text in, either way. Whatever is easiest. Home.
Seattle. Shoreline, I would hope that's good. Oh, Shoreline's, so as it gets bigger, we're gonna see where majority of our folks are watching from. All right. Give this one a few more seconds. Oh, I see Lake Forest Park got a little separated, but we see it in there. North Cape.
Ouch.
All right. Couch, that's good. All right, we can
Do
go.
this exercise in some of our youth workshops too, and it's also hilarious some of the responses we get. I do like couch.
All right, let's go to the
This
next.
was kind of a warm up because we're going to get a couple of these throughout the presentation as a way to kind of get some feedback and input from you all as we go through. So hopefully you can just kind of leave this browser window open on the side and we'll kind of let you know when we pop to another question. So we're going to do another one.
All right. All right, so this next one is what inspires you to be here today? So this one's not going to be a word cloud, but it'll populate. Interested in climate change? Yeah, that's great. Yep. Yeah, that's great. You can also, if you're having trouble getting on the poll everywhere, you can pop things in the chat. So feel free to. All right, this is good. I'm seeing interest in equitable climate action, wanting to do something positive, learn facts about climate, learn more about climate equity. That's great. Learning more, to have a place that is livable. Yes. A just and thriving world. Those are great. Okay. All right. Let's go to our third question. So this should pop up. So how much do you know about climate change? This is for us to gauge a little bit. So looking at 1 being like you've never heard of it. This is your first sort of experience learning a little bit about it. And 5 being I could teach a whole class on it. I know a lot about climate change. Wow, we got a lot of people who know quite a bit. This is great. Got a lot of 4s. Okay, good. So no one's never heard of it. So this is great. I'm glad we got some experts in the room. All right. Well, okay, well, that's exciting. We have lots of 4s, so pretty good understanding, and we'll be diving more into climate change and equity. So I'm hoping that even you all who are 5s get to learn a little bit about something new. All right, so I'm gonna hand it back to Jamie to share.
So we always start our presentations with kind of what is your climate story? I think that every single person in this room or in this virtual room has a connection to the ways that climate change is impacting your lives or the lives of your loved ones, right? And a lot of the Yale Center for Climate Communication recently came out with their latest survey results around attitudes around climate change nationally. And they found out that most people, 70% of people believe climate change is real, it's happening, and we need to take action on it. But one of the questions that was below 50% was the question of, do I think climate change impacts me personally? And that one, it was at 40 something, I think it was like 43%, which is surprising, right? Because in actuality, every single one of us is being impacted right now, and that it will continue to worsen over time. And so part of the reason I put this out here is part about making the connection between equity and climate change is how we tell the stories. How do we tell the stories of people who are being disproportionately impacted and use those stories as a way to move policy and action, right? So I wanted to start off with my climate story, which is I grew up in Hawaii, and I've been in Washington for about 16 years. But my family is still there, and it's a place that I still go back to see my family and and this is the ways that I'm seeing climate change directly impact where I grew up. So these pictures are from the top. It's from when we had a king tide event, so very, very high tide combined with record rainfall. And so we had flooding in the streets, and then we also had to the point that some of our rivers and streams were overflowing into the sidewalks. And so on the top right corner you can kind of see little fish swimming in the streets. And then we're also literally losing land into the ocean. And on the bottom right is a picture of Waikiki Beach, which is during another king tide where there's virtually no beach left. Normally the beach is a good like 30 feet or so to the left. So this is a big change we're seeing. Another big thing that we're seeing is the hurricane seasons are changing dramatically. This top picture is from 2015. This was the first time we had 3 category 3 or higher hurricanes that were within days of each other. So you can kind of see the Hawaiian Islands in between the first and second storm, and each storm is larger than the entire state. And this is devastating in many ways from an emergency preparedness standpoint, but also from who has access to housing that can withstand that, where we get food, water, so much gets shipped in during to Hawaii. And I remember when we had a big storm approaching, all the ports would shut down. And so during COVID, when there was a run on toilet paper, that was actually very familiar to me, because every time there's a big hurricane, the stores would run out of toilet paper. And one of the other things we're seeing too is coral die-offs, ocean acidification, and that impacts that it's having on the whole food chain. This bottom, middle, and right pictures are from 2018, so just a couple years ago. We had Hurricane Lane, which was the largest, it was the first category 5 hurricane to get that close to direct impact in a while. And this was right off of the Big Island. So the middle picture is what that waterfall normally looks like on the Big Island. And then on the right is what that waterfall looked like during the storm. And this was just a side swipe of the storm. It wasn't a direct impact, and there was about 4 feet of rain dropped within 48 hours. So it's a significant amount of rainfall and flooding that happened.
All right, yeah, I'm going to share a little bit about my connection and my story around why I'm interested and passionate about working on climate change. So the top 2 pictures for me are my family is from India. My parents immigrated to the US. And so I tried to pick some more recent examples, and we're seeing impacts all over the country, of course, in India. But this picture on the top left is actually just last year, my dad was visiting his brother in their hometown where he grew up, and their monsoon season is getting so much worse, which has never been like this, and it's causing unprecedented floodings, and the infrastructure there is just not prepared for it with such a drastic shift. So we're seeing those kind of impacts. And then on the right, you can see how bad the air pollution is. My mom grew up in New Delhi, and I feel like we're all pretty familiar with our air quality index numbers as of late. But Delhi pretty much on average sits at about 150. And so that's all the time, not just in certain seasons. So of course, I think it's a little different with COVID probably right now, but yeah, so that's another big concern there. And like, that's where I still have a lot of family and my parents have a strong connection to, and I visit often. But I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. So these photos on the bottom, we're seeing impacts there as well. So on the left, this was actually about earlier this month, I think 3 weeks ago, and that's a major highway that, like, with rain events are just getting stronger, and it flooded the whole highway, and cars were caught in the middle of this, and you can see these impacts already happening. And then on the right is just one example of the heat waves that are increasing in the area, which I know we're experiencing in Seattle and shoreline area as well. But with these high heat and continued heat waves, it's really detrimental to folks' health around here. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, and then Jamie and I both live in Washington, of course. So, and of course, most of the people joining based on our poll question, but we're seeing impacts here. Most recently, we're seeing our wildfire impacts. We're seeing air pollution beyond just wildfire smoke. We're seeing flooding impacts and a lot of different things. So, and we're going to be going into those a little more and about the equity component. So I'll hand it off to Jamie.
So I know everyone said they're pretty much, we've got a lot of experts in the room around climate change. So I really just wanted to share this within the context of many of you are essentially like the climate ambassadors who are learning about this stuff and then going to be able to take that out and share that with your friends, colleagues, family members, children, and your network. And I just wanted to share a few analogies when I talk to different people about climate change that helps people kind of make the connection. We do a lot of outreach work and partnership work with different communities. And one thing that we heard a lot is like, well, you know, last year was not that hot. It didn't, you know, we didn't have a heat wave. So how could the climate really be changing? And so when we talk about the difference between weather and climate, and we do this with young people too, where we say, think about the clothes that you picked for the day to wear, that's the weather. And then the clothes that you have in your entire closet for the season, that's the climate. So from day to day, we fluctuate, even from year to year, we fluctuate, right? But the overall trend is going up. So as it gets hotter and hotter, I now have more tank tops and shorts in my closet and fewer thick raincoats or thick winter coats, right? So being able to utilize that metaphor has been really helpful for me. We also know this is just a helpful graph in terms of, again, reiterating that there is fluctuation from year to year, but again, we're seeing the overall trend going up over time. Another analogy that I use when talking to kind of newer folks about climate change is this this analogy of that summer when it's really hot and you wake up in the middle of the night because you had too many blankets on and you're just like, oh, I'm sweating and it's hot. And in this case, we're essentially adding layers of blankets to the earth. We are adding more and more CO2, which is enhancing the greenhouse gas effect. And we are essentially making the earth so sweaty, but we can't take those blankets off, right? So especially when working with children, this has been a kind of a helpful analogy, especially for anyone who's kind of slept through a hot summer with no air conditioning. A lot of people can relate to this analogy too. In terms of, because we work for the county, this is just, I wanted to share a little bit about the county data that we have around where greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. And I think the important thing to note is there are two main ways to kind of measure greenhouse gas emissions. One is around direct emissions and the other is called a consumption-based model. What that difference is direct emissions means I'm measuring just the emissions that I make based on the car, how much emissions I produce driving my car to and from work, for example. consumption-based model takes into account not just the emissions you produce driving to and from work, but the emissions it took to make your car in the first place, to make the tires, to make the car battery, adding that all together and then looking at the overall picture of the emissions it took to kind of live that lifestyle, right? So when you do that model, the proportions kind of change a little bit. When you do a direct emissions model, you often see transportation takes up a huge amount of the pie. In this case, when you do a consumption-based model, you see that goods pops up more, right? So this is, we're thinking about our electronics, the clothing we buy, the goods we buy, things like that. And so this is, I just wanted to kind of bring this point because it's another kind of nuance to climate change that that is important to make sure people understand when we think about what are the biggest contributing factors to the problem of climate change. In terms of climate impacts, this is what we are expecting within the Puget Sound region within Western Washington. And I know that you all have gotten so much on climate change already, so I'm not going to go super in depth on this. And so sorry, I saw your chat, Solo. Got distracted. So this is looking at, we're gonna see decreasing snowpack, which has all kinds of implications, right? For agriculture, for us, for fish, rising sea levels. We're already seeing, if anyone has been out to the coast during a king tide, that those levels have gotten significantly higher. We have some roads in some areas of the county, especially in Vashon, that are getting water over the road, out by Alki as well. And then we're seeing ocean acidification is going up, record temperatures, poor air quality. And the last few years, we've definitely seen the wildfires change dramatically. And then our rain events are also, we're getting hotter, drier summers and wetter winters, right? And so that has many implications, and we'll kind of run through that as well as more high heat days. This is kind of some pictures from across King County of the different implications. So those are just like the environmental changes we're seeing, but when we look at the implications to that, right, what does that mean for our water sources, for your ability to travel from places when there's flooding? What does that mean for emergency vehicles to be able to get places? For our infrastructure, for our stormwater infrastructure, for our wastewater. What does that mean? We also have these things called toxic algal blooms, which thrive on warmer temperatures in the water. And so that's also something we're seeing. More increased landslide risk. And then I put this fresh fruits and vegetables down here because there's also this kind of not fully realized implication of what does this mean for our food systems as we see more drought and less water supply, and not just within Washington, but knowing that our food system is both a national and global system. So what's happening in other places is also going to have a direct impact on us and potentially on the cost of that food as well. So if folks are already kind of struggling with paying for food, like this is an added layer on top of that. There's also been some research that's come out that that some plants and foods are actually seeing decreased nutritional value, and so that's also something that our scientists are watching. And as I talked about, we're an interconnected world. We have people from all over the world who live in King County. We are one of the top 5 refugee resettlement areas in the country. And many people are coming from places where their homelands are literally disappearing into the ocean, or they're having family members that are experiencing typhoons or drought, or there's conflict in their home countries as a result. There's also, as I said, we're all, again, an interconnected system. So it's not just about the food systems, but also our businesses, our infrastructure, that we're all connected, right, to other areas of the world for what we rely upon on our day-to-day lives. So we want to do an activity really quick. And we do this with our young people, and normally what we do is we have people stand up, but because we're on a virtual setting, we're going to do a thumbs up function, or you can do a +1 in the chat box if that's easier for you as well. And so this is we're going to read a series of statements, and we're going to have a chance to kind of talk about how different climate impacts might be impacting you or people that you know. This is what we call these the front lines of climate change. So the places where people who are going to get hit first or worst from a particular impact. And so we wanted to kind of walk through and kind of illustrate that for everyone. So the first one is do a +1, or you can do a little raise your hand or a little thumb reaction around if you or someone in your family has experienced extreme weather events, whether that's storms, flooding, hurricanes, forest fires, and go ahead and do your reactions. I'm seeing lots of hands. We've got 10 hands, we've got a bunch of +1s. So the reason we put this one in here, right, is how many of you remember Snowmageddon? And then you probably like, which Snowmageddon? So we've definitely seen changes, right, in our weather patterns over time, more extreme precipitation, which could be in the form of rainfall or snowfall. And we've seen kind of what does that mean for when our power goes out and you're maybe you're dependent on a medical device that needs electricity, or what if you need dialysis and you can't you literally don't have a car or can't get to the hospital or to your medical facility. I had a friend of mine who during one of these snowpocalypses was pregnant and went into labor in the middle, and she was like, thank God I had a Subaru, because she was like, I don't know how I would have made it to the hospital. This is also knowing that our buses go onto snow routes. And so it becomes, if you're already dependent on transit, that it becomes more difficult for you to get. And if you have a job that maybe is somewhere where you have to be in person and you can't necessarily miss a day, or your bus is not coming as often, that's something that you have to work around, and then having to wait in that weather for the bus. And then, as we mentioned earlier, you know, we have folks who have family in other places that are experiencing extreme weather. And in this case, I would imagine that all people on this call would have raised their hand, because everyone in here, if you're in the Washington area, has experienced the effect of wildfires, right? Then we've also talked a little bit about flooding. We're seeing the once in 100-year floods are now being much more common. They are, maybe they're happening 4 times in 100 years or 6 times instead of once. So that frequency, climate change is what we call, this is a threat multiplier. So it makes existing inequities worse, and something that increases the likelihood of some of these more extreme events happening.
Okay, so for this one, put a +1 in the chat or raise your hand, a little hand function, if someone in your family has asthma or trouble breathing. I'm seeing hand raises going up. Lots of +1s in the chat. Yeah, so, oh yeah, okay, lots of hand raises up there. Yeah, so this one, which myself included, have people in my family who have asthma, and especially with what Jamie was just mentioning about the wildfire smoke, there are these, so we'll see more frequency of these wildfire events, and as our air pollution is poor, as we have more emissions that cause our air pollution quality to decrease, then we see small particulates in the air. They're called PM 2.5 or particulate matter 2.5. And Jamie, you're gonna have to add in what the comparison is to it. But they're so small that when you breathe it in, it can go directly into your bloodstream. So they can have a lot of long-lasting health effects. Jamie, what's the comparison to how small that is?
So this is also why during wildfire smoke season, they were like, like a cloth mask is not going to work outside, because they're so small that it's less than 1/10 of the width of a human hair. And it goes directly into your bloodstream, which can cause inflammation. And that is also a problem if you've had any cardiovascular issues or blood pressure issues or any like heart disease. So it's not just respiratory illness. The other concern that we've had more recently is that there's been studies that have come out showing that the COVID mortality rate actually goes up with wildfire smoke and exposure to PM2.5. And so this is definitely where we're kind of seeing the overlap of multiple crises and how climate change becomes an additional kind of threat multiplier to kind of existing threats that we have. So I lowered all the hands. Raise your hand or put a +1 if you live with children under the age of 10 or any elderly adults. You can define elderly however you want. I'm seeing a bunch of +1s. I have a couple of people who self-identify as elderly. So in this case, we put this here because these are folks who are at higher risk of some of the impacts we're going to see, particularly around air quality and heat. From a heat wave perspective, the Seattle area has one of the lowest rates of air conditioning usage. And it's just infrastructure wise, even though we don't get as hot as some other areas of the country, we were never really prepared for this kind of heat. And we're going to see more and more over 90-degree days as we move forward into the future. And we don't necessarily want everyone getting air conditioning because there are greenhouse gases that are emitted as a result of using air conditioning as well. And so this is also a part of how do we build infrastructure, how do we reduce kind of what we call the urban heat island effect. And then I'll talk a little bit more where you'll see some maps around where those hotspots are in comparison to other areas.
All right, so put a +1 or raise your hand if you live within 3 blocks of a highway or major road. Oh, and we call a major road something that a bus would go down to. So if you live within 3 blocks of a road that you hear buses or see buses running down.
Does anyone recognize where this is, where this picture is from?
You can write in the chat.
You're right in the chat. I-5, yes, I-5.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a picture of I-5 looking, yes, southbound. Mm-hmm. A lot of people got it. I-5 southbound at the 45th Street overpass. And this is this is a picture that I put here because for about 2 or 3 years, I lived 3 years, yeah, 3 years. I lived exactly to the left of this picture, right next to that off-ramp in the U District. And I remember this is before I worked in air quality or environmental health or climate change. And in the summers, you know, it would get hot, so I would leave my window open and it would literally face the freeway. And every day I would get this layer of kind of black soot on my windowsill. And at the time I didn't really think much of it. I just was like, oh, that's gross. And I just wouldn't leave anything on the windowsill and I would wipe it away at the end of the day. What I didn't realize is that I was breathing all of that in. And there's evidence that the closer you live to kind of these major roadways next to freight trains where there's additional diesel or soot or particulate matter that's happening there, that increases your risk for respiratory illness, for different cancers. And does anyone have any idea why I probably lived there for 3 years? Well, UW, that's a good guess. Great view.
Great view.
Part of it is because that was one of
Affordable.
to live, right? It was affordable. It was the place that that I could afford on a you know, a nonprofit salary, and so we see this intersection with wealth and income, and where your proximity to pollution sources are, and what that means in terms of the health impacts and the outcomes that happen as a result of that. So it's okay if you don't want to admit this. I don't think other people can see your hands except us. So this is raise your hand, or if you do not know where your water comes from. And we do this one with our young people in different workshops, youth workshops we've done. And it's always funny because they're like, oh, I know where it comes from. It comes from the store. And I'm like, okay, but where does it come from in your house? Oh, from the faucet. Okay, but where does that come from? From the pipes. And it's always fun when you're working with young people to kind of like probe that a little farther and get folks to think a little bit broader about where exactly is that water coming from. And if anyone has been out up the Cedar River watershed or the Tolt River, we looked up where Shoreline gets its water. And up until 2012, it was just from the Tolt River watershed, and then now it's getting from both the Cedar River and the Tolt River. And so if any of you have been hiking up there, yes, someone's like, Seattle sends us this info, I read the brochures. That's great. But this is also important because as we're seeing decreasing snowpack, we're seeing our water levels kind of change. The Army Corps of Engineers manages a lot of the dams that hold our reservoirs, and they're having to actually change how they manage the water flow both in the winters and in the summers. So what they're seeing is that there's lower snowpack, so there's less water during the summers. It's coming from snowmelt. And then they're actually seeing way too much water in the winters because we're getting more precipitation coming down as rain rather than snow and building the snowpack. This has a lot of implications in terms of, for salmon, it means that our rivers and streams flow is a lot lower in the summer, which also can result in warmer temperatures, which salmon don't like warmer temperatures in terms of where they want to spawn and survivability. And then there's also implications for agriculture and what does that mean for our farmers who are now getting less water coming down for them to use. This is the last one we have, I think, which is, I'm going to clear your hands real quick. Okay, raise your hand if you, sorry, Saba, I'm realizing this is yours. If you didn't use your heat as much, because the bill is just too expensive. If you kind of left it a little bit lower, if you're like, oh, 60 is fine, or you kind of were like, I can survive, I just need to put on another sweater. I'm seeing a couple hands going up. I'm Canadian, so I don't mind. So coming from Hawaii, this was a rude awakening. My first winter here was still the coldest I've ever had. And I think actually temperature-wise, it wasn't the coldest winter I experienced. It just felt the coldest. This is before I knew what double pane windows were and how to layer clothing. But this is something that with a lot of the communities that we work a lot with low-income communities, communities of color, those that are kind of on the front lines of these issues, where there was a recent report that just came out from Puget Sound Sage, where they just did a report on communities of color and their relationship with energy. And there are people who are making decisions around it's just too expensive, I can't afford the bill. and I need my electricity for my fridge, or I need it for the internet so that I can do my job, or in this case, right, this winter, we're going to see some of those changes of my kid needs to be able to go to school. And there's actually been research that's done that says that if your house is below 60 degrees, that you're actually at higher risk for illness. And if we're making those decisions, like you might save a little bit on your bill, but then you're going to pay for it in terms of your health, right? There are other research that was done around the electricity with Puget Sound Stage reports, is that there are people who are making decisions around actually unplugging their refrigerators and putting all their food into a cooler for a weekend to try and save electricity. There's a lot of folks where this decision, I can have Saba can send the link to the report in in the chat so you all can see it. But this is also a hard decision for people who might be on oil heats or a fixed income, or if you're in my case and you have electric baseboard heat and it's one of the most expensive forms of electricity, you're like, oh, do I really need it to be that much warmer? So Saba just changed the report, or just added the link to the report that we were talking about. So we talked a little bit about some of those different factors that we've talked about, and we want to talk a little bit explicitly about kind of the intersection with racial equity and climate change. This really starts back with the fact that place matters, especially in terms of where we're seeing climate impacts, how those impacts are showing up on the landscape. And it's also about what the history of that place is. And so I wanted to acknowledge that, you know, in the Seattle and shoreline area, that we are on indigenous land that was the historic lands of the Coast Salish people, the Duwamish. It's also the lands of the Suquamish, the Lummi, the Tulalip, the Snoqualmie. There's actually a link that we can put in the chat about where you can find your own and look up for yourself in different places across the country, like who the native indigenous peoples were of the land that you're on. But I wanted to put these pictures here because this is a picture of downtown Seattle. So the traditional lands of the Duwamish people, who are to this day not federally recognized, so don't have access to BIA funds or different grant programs through the EPA or anything like that to help support programs for their tribe, right? And this is how downtown Seattle was built, right? We had these sea cliffs, and then there was these high pressured water hoses that basically tore down these cliffs and built what is now downtown Seattle. So it's all fill soil, right? And filled in the mud flats. And you can kind of see the scale of some of these cliffs. There's like a little telephone pole up here. There's a big house here, and then a little tiny person right here. So these are pretty big. And the other thing that happened that was a major change was before the Clean Air Act, or before the Clean Water Act, the Duwamish River was channelized. So we made some pretty significant changes to the physical landscape, right? Yep, Denny Regrade is the downtown picture. So this is on the left is what the Duwamish River originally looked like. So it's a meandering river, right? If anyone knows their hydrology. And this is what the natural river would kind of change flow over time throughout this whole riverbed. And then it would bring sediment out to the mud flats here where there were shellfish, right? And what we did for industry was to channelize it so that we could have a deeper river and then have big ships go up. And then we had major industry all along this area. So this is where Boeing, the fisheries, a lot of different major, to this day, still where Sodo is, right? And a lot of industry is along this river. It's also the location of one of the Superfund sites because it was an area that got so polluted in the land right next to the river. Things back then, the solution to pollution was dilution back then. So if we just build the smokestack high enough, it'll be fine. If we just dump it in the water and we mix it enough with enough water, it'll be fine. And so this had significant changes both for salmon and wildlife, but also for people, right? When we think about one of the only areas in Seattle, in the Seattle proper, that's going to be impacted by sea level rise is also an area right next to the Superfund site, which is also an area that has primarily low-income people and communities of color, which is the South Park neighborhood, right? So that context is important. The other context that's important is to think about what the lasting legacy has been of some of our housing policies. And this is, this is back in the day when we were doing racist redlining policies that were explicitly racist, right? This is a map of Seattle in particular that banks were basically like, we will only lend to you in certain neighborhoods based on what they decided was the desirability of that neighborhood, right? So red meant less desirable or hazardous. Blue is the desirable. And if you were a person of color, you would get steered to only being able to buy in the red areas. But in addition to that redlining and where banks were lending, there was also racial covenants. So this was written into the deeds of properties. And you'll notice this is from the University of Washington, has, and the website's at the bottom. The University of Washington Civil Rights Project has a website where they actually catalog all the different neighborhoods and what the different covenants were in those neighborhoods. So if you want to look up your neighborhood and get a sense of what language was being used, you'll also notice that primarily most of the covenants are heavily in the shoreline and North Seattle area. And this has had lasting legacy in terms of who could buy a house and where. When the GI Bill passed after World War II, which was one of the big ways for people to build generational wealth, it was finally getting access to financial resources to be able to buy your first home, right? And over 90% of those loans went to white GIs and not to the GIs that were Black or people of color. And what that resulted in is what we call this like generational wealth gap. And it meant that if you had a house that accrued equity, and then that meant that you had funds you could tap to maybe send your kid to college, who then could get a better job, who then could like maybe buy their own home. Maybe that meant you could help them buy a home later. That created this disparity in terms of proportionally, there's way less home ownership in a lot of different communities of color. And then, so this is all over King County. It's also all over the nation. This is something that happened in a lot of different major cities. And so, so if you've lived in any other city, you could probably also look up maps on this. But that also meant that like the areas that communities of color were pushed to tended to be the less desirable neighborhoods. These are the places where it was like, oh, it was next to industry, or it was next to, it was not, definitely didn't have the views. And this is national data that is looking at, you were more likely to live next to a toxic waste site if you were a person of color, that you were more likely to have exposure to diesel emissions, nitrogen dioxide, have less access to potable water. We saw that happen in Detroit as well a while back. So this is also something that's been a continued issue, right? When we look at King County as a whole, and thinking back to like where those maps were, right? And I know that Autumn had also has done some mapping around resilience and communities and social demographics in a previous webinar. So I'm excited to kind of see how that might line up with some of our data here. This, of course, is based mostly on 2010 census data. So we'll see, because if you haven't done your census yet, you still have another month. The census is super important in terms of the data that we collect to be able to inform policy decisions. So this is looking at poverty in King County and looking at the percentage of the federal poverty level. And you'll see that there's correlations as we go through these maps, that the same areas keep lighting up as red, right? Or dark colored, right? In this case, this is looking at the percentage of foreign-born population in King County, so where we have a lot of immigrants and refugees, or just coming in on H-1B visas, or Just that's kind of what you see the pop on the east side over there. And then the percentage of people of color. We also, as King County, have a higher percentage than the United States average. In terms of speaking English less than well, we also have a higher percentage of that than the US average. And we also see that primarily it's, again, South King County and then also Shoreline. When we start looking at like bigger maps that are looking at not just median income, but looking at, this is health and economic data. So this is an index of looking at health outcomes, as well as life expectancy, poverty, housing quality, and employment. So all of those things, we'd start to see that South Seattle, South King County tends to have a much higher proportion with low opportunity. The other thing is when we start to look at health outcomes. So this is looking, these ones are all from our public health department. We're looking at all these different things. There's actually a 10-year life expectancy difference on average between North King County and South King County. So South King County has a 10-year less life expectancy average. That doesn't mean that there aren't folks who are falling in the red, because again, you'll see some areas on the edge of Seattle shoreline border that is also popping up, kind of that reddish color, and then out into like Lake City area. But in terms of where we see this continued trend overlapping of multiple factors, right, is again in primarily South King County. The Washington State Department of Health has this thing called the Washington Tracking Network, which Saba can probably pop the link in. They've released an environmental justice index map, which is actually for the entire state, but we just clipped King County. And this is showing an index of different environmental exposures. So everything from diesel emissions to point pollution sources to PM 2.5, looking at all these different factors and then kind of making an overall index of that. And you'll see that, again, this area in South King County, there's a couple of factors that are playing into that. So not just the socioeconomic data, but there's also, when we look at like PM 2.5, and we'll get into this, I'll get into that a little bit later, there's also natural topography that contributes to some of these issues too. And then the other thing is that's also where there's an I-5 corridor running right through here, right? And it's also in a lot of this area, the trains actually run through the middle. If anyone's been down to Kent, you know that the trains and the freight trains run right through downtown Kent, right? And we've seen more and more coal trains running through and oil trains running through that have implications both for the health of the people of the town that it's running through, but also climate change, right? And where is that coal coming from, and where is it going to go be burned? And so a lot of our coal is coming from Montana and then being shipped to China. Do you want to talk about this one, Saba?
Sure. So this is a graphic from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and showing a pretty good cross-section of what all of the impacts we can expect from climate change on human health. So we're going to see things from extreme heat, which we already talked a little bit about, and talking about heat-related illnesses that'll come from that. Things around water quality impacts and how we're going to see more toxics in our waters, which can make it dangerous for us to go into them. Increasing allergens is one we talk about, which we both have a shared experience about. I used to not have many allergies at all, and over the years I've suddenly developed an allergy where I have to take allergy medicine every day, or it's pretty tough. So that's something, as our seasons shift and we're going to experience more of that. And you can look at a few of these other ones. Jamie, are there any other ones you wanted to call out?
Yeah, the allergy season definitely is one that we're experiencing in Washington. Longer allergy season, worse allergy season. Go ahead and +1 if that relates to anybody on this call. The other thing that's interesting is vector-borne diseases. So this is This is like mosquitoes and ticks and things like that. We're seeing, you know, the range of mosquitoes that used to be kind of tropical diseases moving farther and farther north as we warm, right? And so that's something that our public health professionals are really thinking about, is how do we kind of prepare for the changing range of some of these diseases and as we move forward. So this is the PM 2.5. This is obviously not during a wildfire event because that would just be all dark red. This is kind of looking at an average before we had wildfire event season. So looking at kind of, this is the topography piece I was talking about. So this is where we have what's called inversions. So it's where like the air gets trapped basically in a little bowl, and due to the topography and then the temperature difference between the air. And that happens a lot in the Green River Valley. And then I've also seen it have pockets in back in the hills of Kenmore. If anyone's been back there, it's like this crazy rolly hill. And there's other places around the country that have definitely struggled with this. Missoula, Montana struggles with inversions all the time. And then it's essentially when you already have poor air quality, it's trapped, it's not getting mixed, and it's staying there. When we have wildfire events, this is also, you know, it's getting trapped there for longer. This is looking at, this is from a week or so ago. I took a screenshot of the Air Now site because I was just like, I've never seen it purple. I've seen it red, but I hadn't seen it purple before. And you can definitely see in Eastern Washington, we're just seeing much, much more hazardous rates than we've seen anywhere else. And this is particularly when we think about people that have to work outside, or our farm workers, or, you know, we have even our bus drivers who are inside, but, you know, they're constantly opening the door, shutting the door. And our delivery workers, but that these are people who are getting much more exposure to poor air quality and who maybe cannot stay home or inside. I don't know about anyone else, but even for the last week when I had every window in my house closed, I had 2 air filters going, and I still had a sore throat and burning eyes just from the wildfire smoke. We're gonna unfortunately be seeing more of this happening over the coming years. This is the high heat map. We're working, actually, we just did a heat mapping campaign, which we had volunteer drivers that drove different routes all across the county on our one super hot over 90-degree day in July, at the end of July. Where we needed to have at least over 90 degrees. We couldn't have wildfire smoke, and it had to be a clear day. And we had drivers collect data at 7 a.m. Was it 6 a.m. or 7 a.m.? It was really early in the morning. It was really early in the morning, 3 p.m. and then 7 p.m. With the idea being that we wanted to track real-time temperature of what it felt like to be walking down a sidewalk, for example, and measure that from the morning to the afternoon to see how much heat gets retained, which has a lot to do with how much concrete there is, asphalt there is, how many trees you have, how much shade you have. And you can have anywhere from like up to a 20-degree difference sometimes between blocks, just based on some of the topography, right? And so this has a lot of implications about where and how we build our buildings, what kind of policies we have around trees. The county just launched a new 3 million trees initiative that is not just planting trees, but also trying to protect the existing trees we have and preserve the health of our forests. And so this is something that that we're going to be looking at in terms of how do we address things not just from a tree planting perspective and built environment, but also the little dots we have here are cooling centers or water features. A scale, sorry, I think I cut off the scale on this map, sorry. I will note for next time that I need to add that back in. So this is kind of where you'll see there's a lot of resources within the city of Seattle and kind of fewer as you go out. And so this is really about how can the county support some of our smaller jurisdictions and being able to provide resources to their populations. When we look at transit access, this is also looking at how far people have to walk to get to transit, how many people are transit dependent, so they don't have a car, they use it to get everywhere, and where Metro needs to think about increasing transit access, both as a way for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also providing access for people in terms of getting to jobs, and we don't necessarily want them to be buying cars, right? So how can we provide an even better public transit sector? This has definitely been a challenge with COVID for Metro and for them having to adapt to a changing climate and a changing, pun not intended, but a changing situation with COVID. One of the things they've done is they have a plan to move to completely zero emission buses. And part of this is looking at how can we move, if we're going to move to that so that we can reduce our diesel particulate matter. Most Metro buses are already hybrid, so they're already kind of halfway there. But this is moving to completely electric to reduce all kind of diesel emissions. And then if we were to implement that, where could we implement to have the biggest impact on air quality concerns? And so they did an equity analysis and they were like, if we start in South Base, we're gonna have it everywhere. But if we start in South Base, it's gonna have the most tangible impact right away in terms of air quality and who is at the highest risk, right? Another thing we're looking at is looking at energy and energy justice. We already kind of talked a little bit about this and we put the link to the report here, but something that's new in some of the work we're doing is trying to really bridge the gap around access to renewable energy, access to solar, access to low-income assistance programs. There's also an issue around, there's a difference in terms of what kind of programs are available to you if you live in Seattle City Light Territory, which is a public utility, versus Puget Sound Energy Territory, which is a privately owned utility. And that also has a difference in terms of language access and what materials are available, as well as what kind of documentation you need to provide. And there's also concerns from people that are undocumented around applying for things like this and whether or not that would threaten their, even folks that have maybe a green card with our current political climate, it's concerning to folks around like, does this count as a public charge? Will this affect my immigration status? And so really we need to be looking at things holistically and how can we create better programs that have lower barriers. This is looking at green space and tree canopy coverage and access to green space. The county has a land conservation initiative where there is an initiative to try and preserve land for green space, parks, open space, before it kind of gets bought up and developed right away. And there was an analysis done there around where could they kind of focus to increase green space the most. So you'll see in the red areas, that's where the highest need is. And in the green areas are the areas where they already have a green space within walking distance. The other thing I wanted to note that doesn't get talked about a lot in terms of climate change impacts and different communities is that there's also a piece around cultural loss and mental health, right? And one of the things we're seeing with our Native communities is that there is literally loss of land. There's a Quinault tribe out on the Olympic Peninsula is having to relocate their ancestral village because it will be covered by sea level rise. And then we're also seeing the range of traditional foods and food access kind of changing. Huckleberries were growing in areas that are now higher, that are now moving higher up because it's getting warmer and warmer, or the blooming seasons are changing, the fruiting seasons are changing. They're seeing that some of our native trees are being less resilient to the drought that we're seeing in the summers. And so we're kind of seeing a shift in our overall climate and what species are able to thrive and where. And what does that mean for traditional cultural practices? We also work a lot with some of our Pacific Islander communities in King County. And there's also this sense of, you know, land, their traditional lands are disappearing into the oceans, and bringing up their children here thinking they're never going to know where the origins of some of our cultural practices come from, or some of our stories come from, because they won't be able to go back, right? And so there's also this piece there about what we're thinking about in terms of cultural loss for different communities. I love this graphic because, not because it's really sad, but because I think it really helps kind of summarize a lot of the things we talked about through all of this, which is that there are a lot of different causes that increase your sensitivity to climate change, right? This is from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. They have a really great report around equitable and community-driven climate preparedness planning. And it talks about how it's not just, you know, age and your current health conditions and those sorts of things, but it's also adding in social factors like where you live, and whether or not you have access to people that speak the same language as you, whether or not there's green space, affordable health care, transportation, quality housing. And then on top of that, what kind of is contributing to your access to all of those things? So poverty or racial segregation or income inequality, access to education, whether or not you had a neighborhood that was invested in, whether or not you have access to leadership or policymakers. And all of these things kind of contribute to your overall sensitivity.
All right, so we're gonna do another couple quick poll questions. I hope you kept it.
How do I stop sharing?
I was like, you can stop. Yeah, if you kept the tab open, you can just go back to the same tab, but I also just popped the link in the chat, so you can copy that.
Okay, I'm stopping sharing.
Did it stop sharing? Okay, let me share. All right.
We kind of want to get a sense of what kind of is standing out to you, both like as a, so first question is what climate impacts are kind of the ones you're most concerned about or most important to you.
It breaks up the word sometimes. We get increased heat. Food supply.
We have food supply,
Mhm.
supply chain,
Fires, yep.
oak. Trees is a big one, turned out.
It does break up the words a little, so we're losing some of the phrases in here, but seeing urban heat, yep. Flooding, smoke. Health, yep. I'm getting some in the chat too, I think.
So we're gonna, after we do this next questions, we're gonna do a little bit about what the county is currently doing around these issues, what's in our new climate justice plan, and then we have a little call to action at the end, and we'll open up for Q&A after that. So I just wanna give people a little preview. We are almost towards the end.
All right, where we can go to the next question.
Yep.
So lots of great responses here. Yep, anxiety, big mental health is a big piece of this too. All right, so the next one we have is what has stood out for you in the presentation so far. This might be a similar answer to what you just answered, or it might be a little different, something new. There you go. South King County impacts. Mm-hmm. Inequities, climate inequality, yep. Good explanation. Yeah, Jamie. Overlaps, yep, with racial inequality. Yeah, looking at geography and racial profiling in the past policies. Yeah, and if you're having trouble, again, you can always use the chat box if you're able to use the poll everywhere. Redlining in King County. Yeah. Income and racial inequality. Yes, green spaces in South Seattle versus North.
Oh, this is a good one. Someone says that how clear it is that where you live determines how well you live, but ultimately we all suffer. That's a good point.
All right.
All right.
I'm going to stop share. Jamie, if you want to do it again.
Okay.
All right.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about the county's strategic climate action plan and what's going on. Oh, thank you, Autumn. Autumn just shared this public health impacts from climate change and shoreline, which I'm excited to dive deeply into. But this is, so the county has a 5-year strategic climate action plan. There's been a greenhouse gas reduction plan for over the last 10 years. But the last 5 years was when, and actually Autumn helped work on some of this when she was at the county. And then there was a climate preparedness section that was kind of first really kind of integrated about 5 years ago. And this time around when we did the next update, my position was actually created as a result of the last climate plan. And this time around there was this desire to integrate equity into the plan and figure out how we could better work with the communities that were being most impacted by climate change. So we just released this proposed plan on August 27th. Which you can find. Saba can drop the link in if you want to dig deeply into it. The whole plan's like 329 pages, but don't worry, there's an executive summary that's much shorter. And we're actually going through the council hearing process, which will start in probably in January, and then it will be considered for adoption. So it's not final yet until there's an adoption by council. So there's 3 main sections we just added in. I was the lead for this second new section of the plan, which is our climate justice framework. And this was informed by a climate equity community task force that was made up of different communities, a wide array of different Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, immigrant, refugee, different ages, different organizations, everything from housing organizations to environmental justice to social services to language access, cultural organizations, to really kind of try to bring together a diverse group of people with a heavier emphasis on South King County because we know that that's the area that's being disproportionately impacted. These are all the different goal areas. So there's different actions. There's a whole bunch of actions listed in each of these. On the greenhouse gas emissions reduction side, you'll see everything around buildings and energy, the waste, right? Consumption is like waste management, a transportation land use, green building, forest and agriculture. And then on the preparing for climate change side, this is the 5 different main strategies, but she's also got things broken down by different climate impacts. In our section, we have 8 different focus areas, which I will dive into a little deeper. But I wanted to note that we built off of some really great regional work. This is something that's been building. The Pacific Northwest is a leader in really integrating climate and equity. Got Green and Puget Sound Sage released Our People, Our Power, Our Planet, which is a community-based participatory research that came out in 2016 This was a report that interviewed over 300 people of color in South Seattle, and was something that kind of really pushed, like, we need to connect climate change with health. We need to connect it with housing. We need to connect it with food security. And I remember starting at the county, and our public health department had copies of this and was like, this is great. We need to start focusing on health. So they actually just released, and I should add that next time. Let's add a picture of the cover to that. Our public health department released the Climate Change and Health Blueprint last year that talks about how they want to address the health impacts of climate change. Multnomah County down in Portland was one of the first to kind of do a climate action through equity reports. That's here. The City of Seattle did an Environment and Equity Initiative, which was a bunch of community-driven policy making by communities of color. And then this is a cover of the Puget Sound Sage report that we mentioned earlier about transitioning to renewable energy. I think the big thing to note that you'll notice it's different about the county's plan compared to other jurisdictional plans is most plans you'll see are, this is what we're going to do to reduce our building usage, energy usage, and what we're going to do, our transportation department's going to do about this. And most of it is actually just about county operations or city operations and what we have direct control over. The county actually made goals at 2 levels, one around operations and what we actually have direct control over, and then another level around the region as a whole, so things we don't control, because climate change doesn't necessarily care who owns what building, but what the overall emissions are, right? So throughout the plan, every action has identified what the role of King County is. So in the case of implement, this is where we have direct control. We have jurisdiction. We are the ones kind of who can make immediate action on it. And then convene is where we recognize we don't have complete control. We got to make sure we work together. Maybe our job is to bring those people together. So the county has something called the King County Cities Climate Collaborative. There's K4C. Which Saba can link to. This is a coalition of I think we're up to 17 cities across King County, because the county doesn't have direct jurisdiction within cities, right? And so in this case, it's working together with our cities to kind of agree to shared climate goals. And this also means that some of our smaller cities that maybe they have like half a person that works on sustainability overall, and maybe they don't have even the staff at all to work on this, that we kind of collectively bring together that brain power. And they worked on a green building ordinance that then all together they worked on it. And then that could get passed in multiple cities all at once. So that's an example of a way. Shoreline is a member city of that, and Autumn, I know, is a representative on that as well, so you can always ask her questions. And then support advocate is the last one, where we recognize there are places where we don't have control, and but we want to at least try to influence the conversation and use our position that we have and our voice that we have. So for example, we don't have regulatory authority over our utilities like Puget Sound Energy or City Light in this case, but we can testify at the UTC, which is, I think it's Utilities Transportation, I always forget the name, Utility Transportation Commission, something like that. And we can provide testimony there. We could help amplify the voices of different community members who can't afford to show up to an all-day committee meeting in the middle of a workday. And so how do we find ways to kind of bring new voices to the table on things that maybe we don't have direct control over? So I think that's what's really unique, is that there are ambitious goals throughout the whole plan. The one big thing about the new section of the plan is that we're really trying to change the way that we interact, and I hate using the word engagement, because this is really about building towards partnership. And so this is the King County Community Engagement Continuum. So we talk about some cases, we just need to get the word out. If there's a public health emergency, we just need to get it out in as many languages as possible. And there's a time and place where we need to be working on that end of the spectrum for sure. Then there's also maybe we're working with communities on things. where we have to move quickly on something, or we need to at least try to work with communities. But then we want to kind of get to a place where maybe we're like in a dialogue, we're working back and forth on something. And it's not just 3 public meetings that we host, but we have an ongoing partnership and relationship. We worked on a transcreation project, which is we worked with different community organizations to work on translating climate materials, like Climate 101 materials for different communities in multiple languages. And our old materials, when I first came to the county, we talked about decreasing snowpack, and there was a little icon of a guy on a ski lift. And one of our community members said, I don't know what that is. and I was like, oh yeah, because you need a car. You need to like learn how to do it. You have to have the equipment. It's expensive. Lift tickets are expensive. So it's not something that was accessible to a lot of community members. And so we came up with new infographics that were based on examples that were relevant to them. And you'll actually notice in this case, this is the Samoan one and the Arabic one, that the world actually shifts depending on the language, so that we can use examples that are relatable to that particular group. And then we're working towards how do we actually collaborate together on co-creating policy. So this is where we're going to talk about the Climate Equity Community Task Force. And then the last one is maybe it's not our job to even lead. Maybe in some cases, our job is to support the efforts that are coming out of communities of color and frontline communities. And maybe we're just a funder, or maybe we're just providing technical assistance and we're following their lead, right? Where is my mouse? So this is like all the wonderful faces that were a part of putting together this new section. But this section was really developed by these amazing community leaders of the Climate Equity Community Task Force, and really identifying frontline communities as those that are being disproportionately impacted by climate change, have faced historic and current inequities, and then have kind of that limited capacity to adapt. So it's those factors of all of those things. So, you know, you might live next to a floodplain or next to the shoreline, and you're experiencing sea level rise disproportionately. But if you have a multi-million-dollar house, you have more resources to adapt than somebody else, right? So really trying to like look at who truly is the most vulnerable out of all that. And then recognizing that those communities also have a unique insight and experience around what could be the possible solutions, and that are also very resilient and have come from places where they've had to come up with adaptations to changing climate. So recognizing that lived experience and expertise as well. We had a video, but I'm going to skip it because we're running a little behind time, and I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. But I can, I'm going to skip it.
My name is Jill Mangaliman.
That was a video of one of our task force members at the press conference, which we can share the link if folks are interested. But these are the 8 focus areas that came out of the community-driven process, and recognizing, and these are all things we just talked about throughout the whole thing. And so this is looking at how are we building the capacity of people who are disproportionately impacted to be at the decision-making table. This is everything from even how we run our meetings, what time we run our meetings. Are we providing food? Are we providing childcare? Are we doing this at different points and different entry points so that, you know, someone who works in the evenings could still have an opportunity to weigh in? So providing lots of different ways for people to engage, but then also lifting up leadership. And so if we have time, I might actually play the video at the end. So we'll see how we do. So this is also changing the infrastructure with which the county does these practices in the first place. So doing the Climate Equity Community Task Force was a new thing for the county, a new way to kind of build out. And there was some apprehension, right? Because it's a new way of coming up with these things. We also had number 2, capacity development. This was, we had community members saying, you know, we know about climate change, but we're not talking about it necessarily in the same language as an academic or a policymaker. How do we kind of learn that language so that we can educate our community members in their languages so that they can be the ones that are able to testify, are able to sit on advisory panels, to sit on commissions. So really making sure we have materials in multiple languages, supporting leadership development programs. We do a big piece of this too is youth workshops and thinking about how do we support the next generation of climate leaders in their work. And there are some amazing young people in the Washington and in the King County area that are already leading on this. Number 3 is green jobs. So this is thinking about the future of the work that we want to do, and not just as we transition to a clean economy, there are jobs that are going to be phasing out. So how do we make sure that people are going to, they need a good living wage job, and we don't want to leave people behind. So how do we kind of build skill sets, create opportunities for people to kind of move to jobs in new industries that are better for the environment? But this is also thinking about just jobs in leadership, and do we have diversity in our leadership and in our policy making, in our scientists. I'm going to skip to this slide really quick because this really shows, like, nationally, this is data around environmental organizations, both government, nonprofit foundations, the representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in everywhere from interns to leadership. And the environmental sector in particular is probably one of the worst in terms of diversity. And so, so really we need to create pathways for people into all those spaces. Community health and emergency preparedness. This is about connecting to our public health outcomes, our public health department, giving more resources to communities around trainings, how to prepare for emergencies, looking at our data and how we're collecting data and how we're utilizing that data to make policy decisions. How do we work with communities to identify what data we should be using? And then food systems, food security, there's a couple here that are new to ever being in the climate plan, and food systems and food security is one of those. So really recognizing that closing that gap around being able to afford food is a key part of being resilient to climate change impacts, right? So we also talk about land access, trying to support the Fresh Bucks and expand the Fresh Bucks program. So if you're not familiar with that, that's when you have food stamps, you can basically get a 2-for-1 at a local farmer's market, which has multiple benefits because it's for every $1 you spend, you get $2 to spend there, and it makes your dollar stretch farther. You're able to buy fresh local produce, which also supports our local farmers. So it's a kind of a win-win all around. So we really want to be able to support those things. Housing security, anti-displacement is also new to this plan. We really want to, this is the first time we worked with our Department of Community and Human Services around if you're displaced from a neighborhood, for example, where I used to work in a Chinatown International District where we have a lot of non-English speaking elders, and if they were to be pushed out of that neighborhood into neighborhoods where no one speaks their languages, where they can't find the foods that they're used to, or they don't have someone who can help them that knows how to speak their language, that can be make you less resilient when there's an emergency or some sort of climate event. And then we also worked with our regional affordable housing task force folks around how do we make connections between making more of green affordable housing and closing the gap for affordable housing developers around this. So there's one of the first few projects doing that is now being under construction in Renton, which is a home ownership community built by Homestead Community Land Trust that utilize money for green stormwater infrastructure, green building certification, and it's going to be an affordable housing development. Green energy justice utility, we talked about this a little bit already, trying to close that energy gap. And this is a lot of influence in this one because we don't have a lot of direct control, but we're committed to that influence piece. And then lastly, transportation and access and equity. Metro ran a equity mobility cabinet, and it has this new mobility framework, really looking at everything from fare enforcement to how do we create more access to Orca Lyft and discounted rates for people? How do we do route planning and service changes in a way that are gonna not disproportionately impact different people? And so there's a lot of good thinking happening around there. I'm going to breeze through this. Is I think one of our last slides, but this is throughout all of those 8 topic areas, there's really 6 strategies that we think should be happening in all this, right? How are we building up the capacity of our internal systems to support better community partnerships and climate equity? How are we prioritizing language access? How are we advancing the leadership of communities that are disproportionately impacted in our processes? How do we come up with solutions that are really getting at the root cause of things and not just dealing with a Band-Aid issue of some sort of symptom of climate change, right? And then how are we building a future that's equitable? So when we are doing solar panels or electric vehicles, how are we making so that not people who can just afford those things get access to those things, but that we have renewable energy opportunities for low-income people, for communities of color. And then lastly, aligning and elevating actions. We have a lot of different initiatives across the whole county and across different cities. How do we kind of work smarter and not harder on a lot of these things, especially as a lot of our jurisdictions are facing budget cuts because of COVID. So we really need to get creative when we think about these things. Lastly, this is what can you do? There's so many of these things where you might have been like, I heard of this already, green your travel, save energy. But I really want you to think about what is your sphere of influence. You know, it's not just, when it comes to climate inequity, it's not just about, you definitely don't want to fall into the savior trap of like, how do I help these poor people that are suffering? But how can I use what positional power and access to resources that I have to help uplift those concerns? Or maybe I'm supporting a small business, or maybe I'm supporting and making very conscious decisions. And so really I wanted to highlight these 3 things, which is, right now, the people that are able to show up to, to testify at something, or to write to your elected official, or to, or it's often the people who have the time and the energy and the language and the resource. And it's not usually the frontline communities who are working multiple jobs or don't have, maybe English is not their first language. And so a lot of times climate equity work is not a top priority because our electeds are just not hearing about it. And so part of this is like being able to really articulate to the people who can make decisions around what you think the priority should be, what we should be investing in, how we should be investing in things, and then really making informed decisions about as a consumer, as a voter, and then I put here, start a climate justice conversation, right? Like people often trust their peers and people like them, and trying to, if you can start that conversation and bring more allies along, like that's huge, right? So even thinking about like who, not even just your immediate family, but also maybe there's an effort we can make at my company or at the school I work in, or the and what are the things that how we can make a bigger collective impact around that. So this is a lot of questions, so maybe we'll just do one to close out and then we'll open it up for questions. Do you want to, Saba, do you want to do the last one? What are we taking away from?
Yes. All right, let me just share. Okay, so this question, what is something you are taking away with you? So something you learned, an idea for an action you want to take, maybe a new perspective, or a topic you're interested in learning more and researching about. You can pop it in here. It's the same link, or you can put something in the chat too, if that's easier for you. Cultivating empathy. It's a great one. Oh, we got a bunch pop on. All right, yeah, this one's a word cloud, so we'll see which words are said the most, but frontline, trying to understand frontline communities better, doing some more work in shoreline. All right, give it a few more seconds. I got some things coming up in the chat. All right. Jamie, I can't see the chat actually.
Oh, I can pop up.
I was like, I can't see it over. It's not popping over.
I appreciate this was much better for my mental health than the debate. Rent and green energy, affordable housing. Racial covenants still appear on our deeds out here in shoreline. These must be removed, and actually the state passed something where you can actually get that removed now if you want. Then I'll be starting a climate equity conversation with my Rotary Club, supporting the Duwamish people. There's actually an initiative, if you know about this, called Real Rent Duwamish, which is you can actually pay rent to the Duwamish tribe for living on Duwamish land. That is something they started as a way to support their tribe since they're not getting federal funding. I can inform my community members about shoreline climate action. I also know that Autumn talked a bit about previously about some of the maps of shoreline and who's vulnerable in shoreline. So even in shoreline, I mean, we did this from the county-wide perspective, but if you were to zoom into shoreline and just look at shoreline, there are definitely probably areas and populations and communities that are being disproportionately impacted just in shoreline. So that's great. This is great.
Some more answers pop up on here. I'm seeing quite a few things. Looks like we have some school interest in working with some schools.
Yeah.
Food.
There's also a King County has a green schools program, so that is working to reduce food waste in schools. If you're interested in finding out if your school, the schools in your areas participate, you can get them enrolled. It's also helping to close kind of some of the food security gap because it's catching food that would have been thrown out otherwise and making sure that ends up at some of our food banks. I can drop the link to that in somewhere. So I'm going to share our end slide, and then we'll open it up to questions. We have about I don't know how many questions, 7 minutes.
Yeah, really you have till 8:25, so you're totally fine.
Did I share that okay? Is it sharing?
Yeah, there's our fun Zoom pictures. I see them.
I know, we felt like it'd be appropriate to put our Zoom snapshots for this is the new life.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, you can feel free to pop them in the chat box and we'll just address them as they come up.
I know there was one question on the chat about the community gardens. Are they included in the food systems?
Yes. Yes. Oh, this is great. We have representation from Vashon and while we're kind of waiting for any questions, I also just wanted to thank Heather and Cameron and Autumn and Patricia and our shoreline staff and WCU staff for kind of putting this together and inviting us to participate. We're really excited to kind of to have been able to present some of this work. And hopefully we have more support as we go to council. So France Gideon said, getting more community gardens or what. So there's a action around creating more land access opportunity for food cultivation. And so It's primarily focused on like larger scale. There's actually a project right now where they're working on transitioning a property that the county owns to change the lease over to working to a bunch of different immigrant and refugee serving organizations who are going to work on like kind of a larger scale farming operation. And then they're also working on a kind of commercial food kitchen that can kind of also create opportunities to create jobs around foods, food systems. So that's an example. It's going to be, I think the lease is transitioning over in January, but there's more efforts around that. In terms of the actual community gardens effort, a lot of that falls within city jurisdictions. So part of that is our role in that sense is to kind of work with our city jurisdictions around encouraging more opportunities for smaller scale efforts. And then we've also worked on what we have is there's a good example of a community driven effort where the county kind of supported that, which is the Paradise Parking Plots garden that's in Kent. This was an effort by World Relief using what used to be just an asphalt parking lot of a church down in Kent area. And they were essentially, it was actually, they said, we want to build a community garden for our clients. We want to be able to they want to be able to grow their own food and culturally relevant food. And that wasn't really kind of a fund source that's available, right? But that parking lot was also an area where there's a lot of urban flooding, and they would get a lot of stormwater runoff, which isn't great for in terms of water quality and pollution. And so there was a grant for managing stormwater runoff. And so we actually the county actually worked with this community organization to kind of tweak their grant application to frame it more around that. And then they got funding to basically build their community garden and collect rainwater off the church roof into big cisterns and then use that for the community gardens. So, so really it's about how are we getting more creative around some of our funding resources and thinking about the issues as interconnected, right? It's not just can we build a community garden for food security, it's how can we think about solving a stormwater issue at the same time that we're trying to solve a food security issue while also meeting community needs. So that was kind of one thing. So the climate plan has been sent to the county council, and they are not reviewing it right now because they're busy with budget right now. They've got a very difficult budget season ahead of them. So the first hearing is likely to be in either early December or more likely to be in early January in the Mobility Environment Committee. Yeah, and any sort of you can reach out to your council members. You can, you can reach out to any of the leads we have. If you have questions about different sections, if you want to learn more about a section, we're also going to be working on more digestible accompanying materials that aren't 329 pages. So we'll be working on that. But really, making sure that you are able to reach out to different people and make them aware of the work that is happening. Are there many of the issues raised extend to broader environmental problems beyond climate change? Are there groups at the county that collaborate with you on these equity issues? So there's a lot of different equity efforts happening at the county. There's a broader equity and social justice strategic plan. And we kind of took things at a broad overall level of what's the climate piece to all of this. But what I've really been happy to see is that our model has kind of pushed some other departments and programs and things to kind of run their own processes. So there's now an equity cabinet that's informing Metro. There's an equity cabinet forming the open space initiative. There is a Communities of Opportunity initiative. That one has been going on for a while, but that's a collaboration between the Seattle Foundation, Public Health, and DCHS that's focusing on those that are in the bottom kind of 20% of economic and health outcomes, and really trying to target grant making, capacity building, and we were kind of the part of our initiative was to be one of the first. It was the first time we kind of engaged, the climate team had engaged some of those other departments working on other equity issues. So we're really excited to kind of further that collaboration. And what else? I think
we got all the questions. I'm trying to look through this.
Perfect, on time, 8:15.
Great
On
work.
the
We're
dot.
ahead of time a little, but good.
That's wonderful. And we're sending out a bunch of links. And if anybody else has any questions that they missed, the chat is recorded with the session. So those will be available tomorrow afternoon on the Shoreline Climate page. So thank you. I didn't get to ask my poll, and now I lost a couple people, but no, it's fine.
Sorry.
Sharing.
So
I can stop sharing.
just as usual, I wanted to ask, you know, just to get an accurate count, how many people are participating in this webinar with you? And then we also asked a second one, where are you watching from tonight? So we can just kind of see what our demographics are. So thank you for just taking a second to fill that out. All right.
I like to be in my pet.
My pet.
Hey, we're inclusive here. Oh, Deborah, if you want to just type in the chat box, that would be fine. Yes, well, thank you again. This was wonderful. And it looks like I'm the only one viewing from Briar, Mount Lake Terrace. I just had to put us in there. Anyway, I am very excited to, I'm going to end the polling now. Thank you for everyone contributing to that. And I wanted to also just say, please join us next week. We're very excited. Whoopsie, there's the poll results. We're very excited to have Zero Waste Life Hacks happening next week. And slideshow, current slide, there we are. So be sure to join us for that. If you haven't heard Savan McComb before, she's great, she's funny, she's fun, and she just is very inspiring. And then we'll also have Patricia Townsend, who's a former fashion designer and my boss, and a great lady, talking about sustainable fashion choices. So I hope everyone will be able to join us for that. And also wanted to mention that if you didn't see it before, we are, there is the greening your gardening happening. Let me get to that slide, 1 second. Oh goodness, maybe my computer is tired. Well, let me stop that share and try again. So hold on here. There we go. On current slide. Oh no, that didn't work. There it is. Okay, here, natural yard care for Shoreline. This one definitely I'm interested in. It's on Wednesday, tomorrow. Honey, I Shrunk the Lawn. Learn how to turn a struggling lawn into a Pacific Northwest paradise. So that happens tomorrow night at 6:30. So you can register there at shorelinewa.gov, natural yard care. And then there's 3 other sessions in October that look pretty fun as well. So anyway, thanks again, everyone, and to our speakers. Oh, and the poll results, sorry, I posted it for a second and then here's the results. We have 71% washing by themselves, 14% one and then one other, and 14% with their pet. So split evenly between humans and animals there. So thank you for asking that. And Saba, thank you. Jamie, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for watching. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.